She grabbed her blouse like a shield, eyes wide, chest heaving. Around her, other girls clutched their torn kimonos and stained undergarments, hearts pounding with the same dread. The Americans, those foreign giants in dusty boots and 10-gallon hats, were undressing. One woman hissed through her teeth, "They'll see us naked." They had been captured days ago, Japanese comfort girls, used and discarded by the imperial war machine. Now prisoners, now surrounded by men with Western drawls and strange, slow smiles, and now this. But what happened next wasn't an assault. It wasn't humiliation. The soldiers stripped not to leer, but to clean the showers. One pulled out buckets, another poured bleach, a third, to their disbelief, began scrubbing the floors while humming "Home on the Range." No mocking, no threats, just hygiene. Then they handed the women clean towels, soap, robes, and turned their backs to give them privacy. The girls stared, stunned. Was this a trick, or had they stumbled into a world where even captives were treated like people? The road into captivity was a rattle of rusted wheels, hoarse breathing, and thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. The women clung to one another in the back of the swaying truck, each wrapped in rags that once passed for uniforms. Their eyes were sunken, skin sallow, lips cracked from dehydration and silence. They had survived the retreat through the jungles of Luzon, watched the Imperial Army dissolve into fragments, leaving them behind like tools no longer needed. The officers who once barked orders vanished into the foliage. The soldiers who had once taken them at night now offered nothing, not food, not protection, not even acknowledgement. The women, euphemistically called comfort girls, had served the Emperor's war machine in the shadows, their names erased, their bodies traded like currency, and their fates unwritten in official records. Now they were prisoners of a new kind, but not of the kind they had been taught to fear. The Japanese retreat in the Philippines had been chaos distilled. In the final months of the war, as American firepower tore through the islands, the Imperial command structure fractured. Lines of communication were severed, units abandoned their posts, and the comfort stations, small, hidden barracks where women were kept for soldiers' use, were shuttered in panic. The women weren't given orders. They were left with a word: stay. But stay where? In a shack in the middle of a war zone? In the path of tanks and bullets? Some tried to follow retreating troops. Most were driven off. Others simply hid, waiting for the inevitable. What came wasn't the rifle fire they expected. It was trucks, American trucks, and in them, men in khaki, large men, loud men. Some wore hats curled up at the sides, cowboy hats, one woman whispered, as if naming a creature from a folk tale. They had heard rumors, grotesque ones, about what would happen if they were ever captured. That Americans branded prisoners, that they paraded women through camps naked, that they shot those who resisted, or worse, used them until they collapsed and buried the bodies in pits. The stories had been told with certainty, with fear, with the kind of belief that doesn't require proof. And now, here they were, caught in the hands of those mythical beasts. The first hours were terror. They were pulled from hiding places, some too weak to walk. One woman collapsed and was carried. Another tried to claw at her own face, screaming that she would not be taken alive. But the Americans didn't strike. They didn't laugh. They handed out canteens, blankets. One man knelt beside a woman who had soiled herself and, with visible discomfort, gently lifted her into the truck. She stared at him with eyes like knives, but he said nothing. Just nodded, then turned away. Who were these men? They rode in silence. A few women whispered to each other in the dialects of Osaka and Nagasaki. Some didn't speak at all. Their bodies had been occupied, territories for years. The term comfort women, Ianfu, was a lie told in official documents to hide the truth. They were sexual slaves, enlisted, coerced, or kidnapped by military brokers, promised work in hospitals, promised wages, promised nothing, really. Once inside the system, there was no leaving. No letters home, no names, just nights and bruises and breath that never seemed to fill their lungs. Now the truck jolted to a stop. They were in a fenced compound, a temporary POW site, the guard said. But he didn't scream it. He didn't shove them. He explained it, slowly, gesturing like one speaks to lost tourists. The gate opened. There were rows of tents, laundry hanging between poles, and the faint smell of food. Not rice, but something smoky. One girl turned her head. Somewhere, someone was frying something in fat. They were led out, gently, counted, assigned bunks, given water. One cowboy removed his hat and bowed slightly before turning his back to them. A gesture, an odd, unnecessary courtesy. The women did not speak. They were too stunned to ask the only question that mattered. Where had the monsters gone? The question hovered in the stale air of the barracks like incense without a shrine, unanswered and unwelcome. The women lay on wooden bunks, stacked in narrow rows, their bodies turned inward, as if shrinking might erase them. Their uniforms had long since lost meaning. What remained were scraps of fabric, smeared with jungle mud and old sweat, clinging to frames that had been emptied by hunger and obedience. In the weak glow of a lantern hung near the entrance, they avoided catching their own reflections in the dull metal pots lined along the wall. To see themselves now would have meant acknowledging that they had survived, and survival in their world was not victory. It was humiliation. In Imperial Japan, shame was not just personal, it was inherited. To surrender, to be captured, to continue breathing when one was supposed to die for honor was not considered endurance. It was failure. The Bushido code filtered not only through the soldier's rifle, but through the silk threads of femininity. The women, no longer girls, though many had not yet crossed their 20th year, had been discarded by their own nation the moment they became prisoners. The shame was expected, but what followed, this silence, this stillness, this maddening civility, was not. And it was tearing them apart in a way bullets never had. They had been trained to expect monsters in American uniforms. That was the story told in whispers, in warnings scrawled behind locked doors. That American soldiers branded Japanese women with hot irons, that they forced them into cages, that they laughed while committing acts that words refused to hold. They had believed those stories because they needed to, because fear was easier than the unknown, because hatred is easier to carry than uncertainty. But now, lying in relative comfort, on beds that didn't bite, under blankets that didn't stink of blood or sweat, they waited for the cruelty that hadn't arrived. And the waiting was worse than pain. The indoctrination they had endured ran deeper than they knew. It was not just military propaganda, it was a culture of silence. In their world, women did not speak of violation. They carried it like ghosts carried chains. And now, among one another, they still could not name what had been done to them, much less what was happening now. There were no words in their language for kindness without obligation, for safety without strings. That absence created a void. Into that void poured doubt, and in doubt they began to fracture. One woman clutched her knees in the dark and whispered prayers through cracked lips. Another stared up at the slatted ceiling, blinking as if to erase the tears that betrayed her. A few whispered between bunks, trying to reassert the myths they had brought with them. "It will come," one said. "They're just waiting." "They want us to relax," another agreed, "so we won't fight back." That narrative, the inevitability of violation, was somehow more comforting than believing nothing was coming. Because if the enemy wasn't monstrous, what did that make the men who had used them before? What did that say about the nation that had abandoned them? The psychological collapse didn't begin with violence. It began with the absence of it. No shouts, no slaps, no threats, just silence, just space. And into that space came memory. They remembered the officers who slapped them for stepping out of line, the men who visited them at night, then left without a glance, the unmarked doors of the comfort stations and the silence inside them, the silence that said, "You are no one, you are nothing, you are a tool." Now, with their captors watching from a polite distance, offering bowls of food and nods instead of fists, the contrast became unbearable. For the first time, they were treated as if they mattered, and it hurt. There were no lectures, no punishments, just time. And in that time, the women began to look at each other with a different kind of fear, not of the enemy, but of themselves, of what it might mean to feel relief, of what it might mean to begin hoping. One woman had a breakdown when handed a clean towel. Another vomited quietly after her first full meal, too ashamed to ask for help. The body remembered starvation, but the mind struggled to understand dignity. And so they lay there, side by side, in a quiet that was not peace, a quiet that was interrogation, each moment unspoken, each breath held, each kindness a question. The monsters had not come, but in their absence, something more terrifying had arrived. Possibility. It began with a whistle, sharp and sudden, cutting through the morning haze like a knife across still water. The women flinched in unison, startled from their bunks. Boots approached. A command was called out, not in Japanese but English, slow and deliberate. A gesture followed. The meaning was clear enough. "Come with us." The women rose hesitantly, their hearts pounding. They had known this would come. The delay had only been a prelude, a quiet before the true humiliation began. Today, they thought, would be the day they were broken. They were marched in silence down a gravel path between tents, flanked by barbed wire and guarded by the strange, broad-shouldered Americans whose accents rolled like gravel in their throats. One woman whispered, "It's the punishment block." Another muttered that they would be stripped and paraded. That was the story they'd all been told. Americans humiliated prisoners by forcing them naked into yards while they laughed from the shadows. And so, when they reached the long wooden structure, when they saw the steaming pipes curling mist into the air, their stomachs clenched with dread. The building was marked with nothing but a number. The door opened. Inside, it was warm, impossibly warm, and clean, not just swept, scrubbed. Buckets lined the wall, the scent of soap and bleach was sharp in the nose. There were towels, fresh ones, folded neatly. Beside them, bars of soap, real soap, heavy in the hand, white and smooth, smelling faintly of lavender. It made no sense. Then came the sound that nearly made one girl scream, boots hitting the floor. The Americans were removing their shoes, rolling up their sleeves. One grabbed a mop. Another pulled on gloves. A third, older, with silver hair under his hat, nodded toward a drain and began pouring a bucket of water across the tiled floor. The women froze. What was this? Some ritual? Some preparation for degradation? But no orders came, no commands to undress, no pointing, no laughter, only motions. One soldier gestured, "You first." Then, as if to make clear they meant no harm, they turned their backs. It was disorienting. In Japanese tradition, the body was a sacred thing, especially the female form. Modesty was not simply politeness, it was honor. Nudity, even in bathhouses, followed strict custom, structure, etiquette. To be seen naked by a stranger, especially a man, was unthinkable. To be exposed in defeat, in captivity, was worse than death. And now here they stood, in the hands of the enemy, given towels. One by one the women moved forward. A few removed their garments slowly, covering themselves as best they could. Others hesitated, trembling. Then came the moment they never expected. The soldiers, without speaking, stepped outside the room. They had left. The prisoners stood stunned in the steam. A few still covered their bodies. One whispered, "They're watching through slits." But there were no slits, no holes, just heat, mist, silence. Then the first water valve was turned. A stream of warm water poured down from the shower head. The girl under it gasped. For the first time in months, water ran over her scalp, her arms, her back. She reached for the soap with shaking fingers. Soon, others followed. The room filled with the sounds of water slapping skin, quiet breathing, the soft rasp of hands scrubbing away grime so old it had become part of them. Some wept soundlessly. Others stood still, letting the heat sink into bone. There was no ceremony, no barking orders, just space, permission. And in that space, fear faltered. Afterward, they wrapped themselves in the clean towels. One girl clutched hers to her chest like it was silk from home. When they stepped outside, the soldiers were there, but sitting at a distance, passing a cigarette between them, speaking softly in English. One stood and nodded as they passed. No smiles, no stares, just a quiet, almost unbearable respect. That was the moment something cracked. Not loudly, not all at once. But in the invisible architecture of their fear, a beam buckled. The Americans had not touched them, had not watched them. They had cleaned the floors, offered towels, and left. That was all. And somehow, that was everything, because it meant they were not there to be used. They were not trophies. They were not shame. They were, impossibly, still human. Later that week, a young medic with soft eyes and sunburned cheeks entered the barracks with a clipboard under one arm and a tin box in the other. He spoke slowly, gently, pausing between each word. Then, as if offering something sacred, he placed a pencil and a sheet of lined paper on the edge of a bunk and nodded toward the girl sitting there, knees drawn to her chest. "You can write home," he said. She didn't respond. She didn't move. She stared at the page as though it might catch fire in her hands, as though it were some kind of trap, a trick, a test. What did home even mean anymore? Around her, the others watched in silence, eyes tracking the paper like prey. No one reached for it. The girl finally lifted it with slow, brittle fingers, as if it might dissolve under her touch. The pencil felt heavier than it should have. The idea that she could speak freely, say whatever she wanted, address someone who might still exist outside the wire, was overwhelming. But it was the blankness that terrified her most. She hadn't held a writing instrument in months. Her thoughts, once so fluid, now moved like broken glass. What could she possibly say? That the Americans had handed her soap and not a rifle barrel? That they had given her a towel and not a command? That not one of them had touched her except to offer medicine or food? The war had trained them to believe that everything was filtered, that letters, if they were allowed at all, would be read, redacted, and buried before ever reaching Japanese soil. The imperial military had a long-standing practice of censorship that turned words into weapons and sentences into puzzles. Nothing that might question the righteousness of the war, the loyalty of the soldier, or the glory of sacrifice would make it past the gates. Women, especially those held in shameful silence as comfort girls, knew their voices were already erased before they opened their mouths. And yet here she was, pencil poised over the paper, with no one stopping her, no one standing behind her, no interpreter hovering. The medic had even left the room, retreating with that same strange courtesy these cowboys always carried, rough hands, soft manners. She was alone with her words, but words are not born from silence. They crawl out of it, wounded and slow. She began, then stopped, wrote a few lines, erased them. She tried to recall her mother's name, and for a horrifying moment she could not. It had been too long. She could see the face, but not the name. Could picture the well in the backyard, the laundry flapping in the wind, the smell of mackerel on rice. But the name would not come. She put down the pencil and curled over the page. Some of the other women came forward now. One picked up a sheet and turned it in her hands, almost as if it were a leaf. A few began to murmur, not loudly, just low whispers, soft as breath, about who they would write to if they believed anyone would read it. A sister, perhaps, a childhood friend. One woman joked, half-heartedly, that she would write to the emperor himself and tell him she was still alive, whether he liked it or not. But even in that moment, no one laughed. The emotional paralysis was too thick. Because beneath the offer of communication was a deeper, more dangerous possibility: truth. To write meant remembering, to remember meant feeling, and to feel meant reopening wounds they had sealed with silence. Worse still, what if their letters were delivered and no one believed them? What if they wrote of kindness and it was read as betrayal? What if they said the Americans were not monsters, and their own people called them liars? The girl still sat with the paper before her. She finally scrawled a sentence. It was not long. It said nothing about the war, nothing about the camp. It simply said, "I am still here. I do not know why." She folded it without rereading it, hands trembling. And for the first time since capture, she wept. Not from fear, not from pain, but from the unbearable weight of having something to say. The tears had barely dried when the bell rang for the first proper meal. Not the thin ladlefuls of broth they had been given upon arrival, not the cautious portions meant to test their stomachs after weeks of starvation, but a full serving, a real one. The kind that arrived on metal trays with weight to them, with steam curling upward like breath on a cold morning. The women followed the others toward the mess hall, footsteps hesitant, bodies light but heavy with anticipation and dread. The smell hit them before the sight. Thick, savory, foreign. It wasn't rice. That much was immediately clear. No familiar sweetness of steamed grain, no seaweed, no miso. Instead, the air was loaded with something darker, richer. Chili, they would later learn. Beans stewed in meat and spice. Cornbread, golden and dense, still warm. Bowls of stew that shimmered with fat and herbs they had never tasted. They froze at the doorway. Inside, American soldiers in aprons stood behind counters, not with rifles, but with ladles. They passed plates down the line like factory workers. Efficient, unceremonious, as if feeding prisoners was no different than feeding themselves. One cowboy nodded to the first girl in line, scooped a ladle of chili onto her tray, and slid a piece of cornbread beside it. She stared at it, did not move. Behind her, someone whispered, "It looks like cake." Another said, "It smells like a celebration." It wasn't either. It was simply food. But after what they had survived, it might as well have been sacrament. The difference between this and what they had known clawed at their guts. In the final year of the war, survival rations in Japan had been nothing more than crumbs disguised as meals, a thin broth from potato peels, a handful of rice divided among several women. At times, nothing but boiled weeds and a cup of water. Malnutrition had become normal. Hunger had become identity. Here, in enemy captivity, they were given more in a single plate than many had eaten in days. Some could not handle it. One girl, no older than a teenager, lifted a spoonful of chili to her mouth, tasted it, and suddenly turned away, hand clamped over her lips, her body convulsed. She barely made it outside before bile hit the ground. Her stomach, unaccustomed to such richness, rejected what her mind could not yet comprehend. A medic followed her calmly, not scolding, not rushing, just placing a hand on her back and waiting. Others sat frozen, staring at their plates, unsure if they were allowed to begin. One girl broke a piece of cornbread in half, then quarters, then smaller shards, as if rationing an imaginary future that never came. She tucked part of it into her sleeve, convinced someone would take the rest away the moment she finished. But no one did. The guards sat at nearby tables, eating the same food, same chili, same bread, same stew. They laughed among themselves, traded jokes, nodded at prisoners when eyes met. There was no hierarchy in the eating, no separate treatment, no performance. And that was what unsettled them most. The emotional violence of it crept in slowly. How could the enemy feed them more generously than their own country ever had? How could the men they'd been told were demons share bread while their own officers shared nothing? It wasn't just confusing. It was painful. It felt like betrayal, to be nourished by those they were told to hate while their families starved somewhere beyond the sea. A woman from Hiroshima stared down at her bowl and whispered, "My sister hasn't tasted meat in years." Another muttered, "My mother boiled bark." Silence followed. Then someone began to eat, slowly, carefully, as if expecting the food to disappear mid-bite. But it didn't. The bread stayed, the stew stayed, the chili remained warm, and as it settled into their bodies like heat into frozen bone, something shifted. Not joy, not relief, something more dangerous. Recognition. For the first time, food was not used against them. Not a reward, not a bargaining tool, not a bribe for obedience or survival. It was simply given. No strings, no humiliation, no price. It was dignity served on a plate. And that realization, more than the taste, stayed with them long after the trays were cleared. That evening the sky over the camp softened to lavender, the last light of day catching on the barbed wire like threads of gold spun across steel. The air held that strange stillness that only comes after an emotional storm, not peace, but a lull. Some of the women sat near the fence line, eyes tilted upward toward a horizon they couldn't cross. Others lingered outside the barracks, arms folded, listening to the murmur of the guards' voices as the Americans settled into their own rhythms of dusk. Then came a sound they didn't recognize, soft, wavering, breath-made. It was a harmonica. At first, they thought it was some kind of signal, maybe a call to another guard post, but the melody that floated out was too clumsy, too irregular to be anything official. It was not a performance. It was private. A lullaby without a child. A man sitting near the mess tent, boots untied, back against a crate, pressing his lips to a dull silver mouthpiece, exhaling something broken and sweet into the twilight. The notes weren't polished. He missed keys. The tempo wobbled. But it had heart. It had longing, and that made it real. One of the women, the same who had hidden her cornbread, sat down on the dirt beside a water barrel and closed her eyes. her breath caught in her throat. The sound reminded her of her brother, years ago, on the island of Okinawa, before the soldiers came, before everything was uniforms and silence. He used to sing to her while she swept the porch, making up songs that made no sense. He had tried to protect her with humor. It hadn't worked. He had disappeared during a draft sweep. She never saw him again. Now, a cowboy played something that echoed that same melancholy, that same defiance, and she was no longer just a prisoner. She was a sister again. Another woman began to hum, hesitant, low, almost inaudible. The melody didn't match. It didn't need to. Across cultures, across fences and uniforms, it wove its own language. It was not the language of victors or vanquished. It was memory, passed breath to breath. Around them, a few of the guards turned their heads, some smiling, one tipping his hat before returning to his cigarette. No one interrupted the song. No one mocked the man playing it. They simply let it live. Music, in its simplest form, is a memory machine. It sneaks past defenses, pulls open doors we thought were locked. In Japan, music had been ceremonial, structured, ritualized. Here it was sloppy and heartfelt and free. But it carried weight all the same. It softened the hard edges of the present. It reminded them of a time before war, before names were numbers, before their bodies were claimed by someone else's war plan. The harmonica wove between bunks and guard posts, lingered in the corners of the camp like smoke. It didn't need translation. It was not propaganda. It was not apology. It simply was. And in that simplicity, there was power. The silence after the music ended was heavier than the melody itself, but it wasn't oppressive. It was full, the kind of silence that comes when something sacred has passed through. A few women wiped their eyes. Others looked down at their hands, unsure what to do with them. The cowboy stood, tucked the harmonica into his back pocket, and walked away without a word. And for a long moment, no one moved. In that stillness, they were not captives and captors, not shameful and righteous, not foreign and familiar. They were just people suspended in a war neither side had chosen. They were just hearts, quietly beating. And for the first time in months, the sound of war was replaced by the sound of a single breath held between strangers who suddenly weren't strangers at all. The next morning carried a lightness none of them could quite name. It wasn't joy, not exactly. More like the echo of it, like the sound of a bird you can't see. It stirred in the way the women moved, a little less rigid, in how their eyes met without darting away. After the roll call, they were told something unusual. The canteen was open. They could go if they liked. A guard, the same one who blushed after complimenting the lipstick, waved toward the far end of the compound. "You can trade your slips," he said. "Toiletries, paper, some extras." The word extras felt like a trick, but curiosity pushed them forward. They walked slow, wary, as if the ground might change beneath them. The canteen was a plain wooden shack with a dusty floor and shelves lined with tins and jars. It smelled faintly of oil and candy and something floral that tugged at a memory none of them could place. Then they saw it. A glass case, slightly smudged, containing things that didn't belong in war. Brushes, nail polish, little pots of rouge, and lipstick. Red. The color stopped them cold. It wasn't the brown red of dried blood, not the cruel red of propaganda banners. This was soft, rich, warm. One woman pointed slowly, as if asking permission without words. Another touched the glass. They waited for a laugh, a snarl, a command to step away. But no one said a word. The American behind the counter, young, with a sleepy kindness in his eyes, simply opened the case and held it out like a peace offering. The first girl to take it hesitated. The tube felt impossibly smooth in her hand, like silk wrapped in metal. She twisted it slowly, revealing the lipstick, perfect and untouched. Her fingers trembled. She looked around. No one stopped her. No one forced her. She brought it to her mouth, dabbed it gently. She hadn't worn color in years, not since the day they took her from her village, not since beauty had been turned into something vulgar and assigned. She looked into a cracked mirror leaning behind the counter and startled at her reflection. A faint smile broke across her face. Then came a sound that hadn't existed in this camp before, a single, unguarded laugh. It came from one of the other women, who couldn't help but grin at the sight. Then another chuckle followed. Then another. They laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd, because it was surreal, because it was theirs. Even the guard couldn't help but grin, his ears reddening as he busied himself wiping down the counter, pretending not to hear. The other women stepped forward now, one by one, drawn by the simple rebellion of color. Someone opened a bottle of polish, a light pink that reminded one of them of cherry blossoms. Another picked up a brush, running it through hair gone stiff from neglect. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about being seen. It was about feeling themselves again, not just as survivors, not just as prisoners, but as women. The act felt illegal, sacred, a reclamation. They weren't dressing for anyone. They were healing. For the Americans, the moment was confusing, tender, quietly humbling. They'd seen prisoners of war in every state, defiant, broken, furious. But they'd never seen anything like this. A room full of women smiling into mirrors, not for seduction, not for distraction, but for something deeper, for memory, for self. Laughter bounced off the wooden walls of the canteen, not loud, but persistent, like light refusing to die. And in that laughter, in those smudges of red, the camp became something the war could not touch. Not a paradise, not a home, but a place where, for a moment, they were no longer reduced to what had been done to them. They were again who they had always been. The next day brought another strange announcement. A patch of land near the far end of the compound, once bare, dry, unused, was now open to them. One of the guards, the one with the harmonica, stood beside a stack of small paper envelopes. Each was filled with seeds. "For planting," he said. That was it. No grand explanation, no conditions, just a gesture and a nod. One woman tilted her head, confused. "Why?" she asked softly, still clutching the envelope in her hands like it might vanish if she blinked. The cowboy shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. "Why not?" he answered. That was how it began. They walked out to the plot, slowly, uncertain. The earth was hard at first, foreign. Nothing like the lush, damp soil they remembered from childhood. There were no tools, just their fingers and a few borrowed spoons, but they knelt down anyway. It wasn't about the seeds, not at first. It was about the invitation, the absurdity of it. Prisoners weren't supposed to grow things. They were supposed to endure, to wait, to decay slowly in silence. And yet here they were, pressing hope into the dirt. The act itself felt ceremonial, sacred in a quiet way. For women who had been treated as objects, as things to be used and discarded, the chance to nurture something was more than symbolic. It was transformative. They weren't being looked at. They were looking down, into the ground, into possibility. Their hands were filthy by the end of it, caked in soil and sweat, but their faces were lighter. Not smiling exactly, something more reserved, more intimate, peaceful. The earth changed them, not all at once, and not evenly. Some of them still struggled to believe in the gesture. One woman refused to plant hers, keeping the envelope in her pocket, touching it from time to time like a secret. Another only watched, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. But even that was different. Watching was a choice. Silence was no longer the same as submission. These were no longer girls being marched. These were women choosing where to kneel. As the days passed, something else changed. The guards began checking the patch each morning, noting the small mounds of earth, the tiny wooden markers the women carved from crate splinters. One brought an old watering can from the kitchen. Another, without saying a word, cleared a nearby patch of rocks. No orders, no supervision, just quiet help, given freely. And the seeds began to stir, tiny green shoots, fragile things, bending toward sunlight that pushed through gaps in the clouds. The first one bloomed unexpectedly, a pale flower, soft and trembling in the wind. A few of the women gathered around it like it was a newborn. They didn't touch it. They didn't speak. They simply stood in reverence. Something had lived. Something had said yes to a world that had said no. In those moments, time returned. Real time. Not survival time, not hunger time, but patient time. The kind that allowed for change, for growth, for a life beyond numbers and uniforms. They started tracking days not by rations or roll calls, but by which flowers had bloomed. The garden became a quiet rebellion. It didn't scream. It didn't resist. It simply lived. And that, more than anything, reminded them of who they had been before the war. If you've made it this far, and this story speaks to you, leave a like and comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. Then came the murmurs. Quiet ones at first, passed between guards like flickers of wind. It's over. They're surrendering. Tokyo's fallen silent. The women didn't understand the full words, but they caught the shift in posture. The Americans stopped moving like men under orders. They moved like men who were waiting. For what, the women didn't yet know. It wasn't until one of the medics came to refill the water jugs, his face unreadable, that someone finally asked, "What is it?" He looked up slowly, the way someone does when they're still trying to believe the thing they're about to say. "The war's ending," he said. "You're going home." The words didn't land, not at first. They sat in the air, foreign and ridiculous. Home? That was not a place anymore. That was a myth whispered to comfort the dying. One of the girls laughed, a short, dry laugh that sounded more like a cough. Another blinked, then looked away. They had heard lies before. They had been told many things by men in uniform. That they were serving the nation, that their sacrifice was noble, that if they were silent and obedient, they would be remembered. None of it had been true. Now it was the enemy, the Americans, saying the war was over, saying they were free. But freedom was too big a word, too sharp around the edges. What did it even mean to be free after you had been owned? The next day, the guards confirmed it. Japan would surrender. Emperor Hirohito himself had spoken, the voice of the divine, rendered suddenly human over a radio that crackled through the barracks. Some of the women collapsed, not from grief or joy, but from the sheer weight of not knowing what to feel. They had been fighting a war inside themselves for so long, the idea that it could end because a man said it was over felt absurd. Was a war real if it could be turned off like a switch? And yet the men who once controlled their every breath were now silent. There were no orders from Tokyo, no threats, no lectures about honor or purity or sacrifice, just stillness. The women didn't know whether to cheer or mourn. Some wept quietly. Others sat, stunned, staring at their hands like they were trying to remember who they belonged to. One whispered, "We're going home." And the phrase felt like a spell, a curse, and a prayer all at once. But what was home? For many of them, the village they left no longer existed. Their families might have died. Their names had been erased from record, their status downgraded to something shameful. They were not war heroes. They were not even war widows. They were comfort women, disposable, forgotten. The Japanese Empire had used them, hidden them, and then abandoned them. Now it was the Americans who were telling them they mattered. "You'll be processed," a guard said. "Sent back. Safe." Safe. Another dangerous word. How could they believe it? Would they return to judgment, to whispers behind closed doors, to mothers who could not look them in the eye, to temples that wouldn't take their prayers? One girl dug her fingers into the flower bed they had planted. The petals were blooming, soft and yellow. Something had survived here. Something had dared to grow. But she knew a flower couldn't follow her home. Still, something had changed. The empire that had told them their suffering was sacred had collapsed under the weight of its own silence, and the enemy they were taught to fear had given them space to be human. That was a kind of victory, too, not loud, not celebrated, but real. And soon they would walk out of the gate, not as prisoners, but as women who had once been forgotten and now impossibly remembered. The gate opened without ceremony. No trumpet, no announcements, just the slow pull of metal as the latch gave way, and the road beyond came back into view. A road that led not into barbed wire, but away from it. The women stepped forward in a line that did not feel like a procession, not like a surrender, not like anything they had known before. Each was handed a bundle, a rough wool blanket folded with care, a toothbrush wrapped in wax paper, a bar of soap, still crisp, its faint scent carrying something almost domestic. These were not rations. They were not tools of discipline. They were parting gifts, pressed into hands that had known only takings. One girl clutched the blanket to her chest as if it were alive. Her fingers sank into its fibers, holding on the way a child holds a favorite cloth when sleep won't come. She had slept on straw, on dirt, on hard boards, soaked with sweat and sickness. This blanket had weight, warmth, something close to gentleness. It wasn't wide enough to cover the years that came before it, but it covered her shoulders now, and in that moment, that was enough. They walked toward the docks under a sky that no longer belonged to war. The air smelled of salt and machinery and something sweeter, something like possibility. American trucks waited, not to carry them back into captivity, but to transport them toward the horizon. Some guards tipped their hats, some nodded. One of them, the harmonica man, stood at a distance, arms folded, watching as though he didn't trust goodbyes to carry the right weight. A few of the women bowed. Old habits, old reflexes. He bowed back. It was small, but it held more than all the speeches no one had made. On the ship, the deck stretched wide and unfamiliar. The ocean rolled out ahead of them, vast, indifferent, older than any nation. One of the women leaned against the railing, staring down at the endless movement of water, searching for the outline of a home she could no longer picture. Somewhere beyond that curve, another shore waited, a country that had not protected her, a society that might not welcome her, a silence that she would have to walk into alone. But as the engines began to hum, something shifted. She reached into her bundle and pulled out another piece of paper, another pencil. She had been given it that morning alongside the soap. "In case you want to write," the guard had said. "No demands, no supervision, just the offer." She sat on the edge of a bench, the sea rocking gently beneath her, and began to write. Her hand was steadier this time. She did not write about war, She did not write about camps or fences or flags. She wrote about what had been hardest to comprehend. They saw us not as shameful, not as enemies, just as girls. The words came slowly, like waves, uncertain, soft, real. She paused, staring at them, testing them for truth. They did not break. Dignity, once tasted, does not disappear. It does not dissolve when circumstances change. It embeds itself deeper than fear, deeper than memory. Once you have been treated as human again, not as property, not as surrender, not as evidence of defeat, you cannot unlearn it. You carry it like a bone mended wrong, but still strong. Around her, the other women stood in clusters, watching the shoreline shrink. Some held their bundles close. Some didn't touch them at all, just stood with arms folded, faces unreadable. A few cried, quiet, restrained tears, not just for what had been lost, but for the complexity of what had been found. Because to feel dignity again after it has been stolen is not simply relief, it is confrontation. It demands that you see yourself where you had learned only to look away. When the land disappeared and only water remained, one of the women whispered, "Do you think they will believe us?" No one answered, because it wasn't a question that needed one. Whether they were believed or not was no longer the point. The point was that they knew what they had lived. Even behind fences, humanity had bloomed, in showers and cornbread, in harmonica notes and lipstick tubes, in seeds pressed into foreign soil. And now, in the sway of a ship headed toward uncertainty, that bloom traveled with them, unseen but permanent, rooted not in land, but in the quiet revolution of seeing oneself as worthy. The ocean stretched wide, but for the first time, what rose in her chest was not fear. It was worth. And if this story moved you, hit like and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's make sure these voices are never forgotten.